At the beginning of the 21st century, the United States faced a growing dilemma: increasingly congested highways, overcrowded airports, and mounting environmental pressure demanding urgent solutions. While Europe and Asia were already operating successful high-speed rail systems, the US remained stuck in an outdated transportation model. It was in this context that one of the most ambitious engineering projects in modern American history was born: the California High-Speed Rail. The proposal was bold and highly attractive. A train capable of traveling over 300 kilometers per hour, connecting San Francisco to Los Angeles in under 3 hours. A clean alternative to air travel, fast enough to compete with domestic flights, and efficient enough to redefine transportation in the wealthiest and most populous state in the country. For many, this project was more than a train. It was a symbol of progress. Official speeches promised reduced carbon emissions, hundreds of thousands of jobs, economic growth, and regional integration. The California Bullet Train would be the first step toward a future national high-speed rail network. A historic milestone, a turning point. At least that was the promise. In 2008, the project gained decisive momentum when California voters approved the initial multi-billion-dollar funding through a public ballot. Public support seemed strong. Confidence in the planning was absolute. Few imagined that this vote marked the beginning of a long, expensive, and deeply problematic journey. If you enjoy real stories about ambitious projects that went wrong, subscribe now to the Wrong Project channel. And leave a comment. Do you think the United States was truly ready for high-speed rail? What almost no one realized at the time was that the project was already born with serious structural flaws. Overly optimistic cost estimates, tight timelines, and planning that underestimated political, legal, and geographic obstacles. The idea was grand, perhaps too grand. The California High-Speed Rail began as a national dream filled with expectations and promises. But as we'll see throughout this video, not every dream survives when confronted with the realities of engineering, politics, and public money. And this story is only just beginning. When the California High-Speed Rail was officially presented to the public, the numbers released appeared solid, controlled, and even optimistic. The total cost of the project was initially estimated at around $33 billion, a high but seemingly acceptable figure given the scale of the undertaking and the promised benefits. The timeline also seemed reasonable. The full system would be operational by around 2020. The plan appeared straightforward. Construction would be carried out in phases, starting with the so-called central segment, connecting inland California cities such as Fresno and Bakersfield, before expanding toward major metropolitan areas. This strategy was meant to test the system, reduce risks, and keep costs under control, at least in theory. Another widely promoted promise was that the project would pay for itself over time. Studies claimed passenger demand would be high enough to sustain operations without permanent reliance on public funding. A fast, modern, and sustainable train seemed perfectly aligned with the future. However, there was a critical detail hidden behind these projections. Many of them were based on extremely optimistic assumptions. Land acquisition costs were underestimated. Environmental challenges were treated as minor obstacles. Legal disputes were largely ignored. Additionally, the project relied on a delicate mix of funding sources: state funds, federal money, and even private investment. If just one of these elements failed, the entire system would be at risk. And that is exactly what began to happen. As more detailed technical studies were conducted, engineers and experts started warning about serious issues. The route would cross sensitive agricultural areas, seismic zones, and densely populated urban regions. Every kilometer built would be more expensive and slower than initially projected. Still, the promises continued. Officials assured the public that costs were under control and that delays were normal for a project of this scale. The official narrative insisted everything was progressing as planned, even when evidence suggested otherwise. What began as an ambitious and carefully marketed plan gradually revealed something troubling. The project was sold politically before it was technically ready, and this gap between rhetoric and reality would come at a very high cost. In the next part, we'll see how the first construction sites exposed serious flaws that could no longer be hidden. When construction on the California high-speed rail finally began, there was a strong expectation that the project had reached a point of no return. Heavy machinery, construction sites, and official announcements created the impression that the dream was finally becoming reality. However, it took only a few months for reality to hit hard. The segment chosen to start construction was the Central Valley, a largely agricultural region that is relatively flat and, in theory, easier to build. The decision seemed logical: fewer tunnels, fewer complex viaducts, and lower costs. Yet even in this supposedly simple area, problems emerged almost immediately. One of the first major obstacles was land acquisition. Local farmers, many of whom had owned their land for generations, disputed the compensation offered by the state. Lawsuits multiplied, delaying entire sections of construction for months, and in some cases, years. Each legal dispute meant higher costs, longer delays, and greater uncertainty. Environmental issues that had been downplayed in early studies also surfaced. Protected species, impacts on waterways, and land use changes forced design revisions and new approvals. Environmental regulation, though necessary, made it clear that the original timeline was far from realistic. From a technical standpoint, challenges also began to appear. Route adjustments, the need for additional structural reinforcement, and changes in foundation design significantly increased the cost per kilometer. What had been planned as a low-cost segment began consuming resources at an alarming pace. Meanwhile, the public started asking uncomfortable questions. Why didn't the first segment connect major cities? What was the purpose of a high-speed train that started and ended in small towns? Media criticism intensified, and public support began to erode. Most concerning of all was the growing realization that the project lacked a clear path to completion. Isolated segments were being built with no guaranteed continuation. It was like constructing a bridge without knowing whether the other side would ever be reached. The start of construction, which should have confirmed the project's viability, instead revealed something far more serious. The California high-speed rail was not just delayed, it was structurally unprepared to move forward. And this was only the beginning of the problems. As construction dragged on in the Central Valley, one issue began to dominate every discussion surrounding the California high-speed rail. The money was running out. What had once been presented as a financially manageable project started revealing increasingly alarming figures. Budget revisions became routine, and each update brought higher costs than the last. The original budget, estimated at around $33 billion, was repeatedly revised upward, first to $50 billion, then to $68 billion. In some more recent projections, total costs surpassed $100 billion. What was once considered a strategic investment began to look like a bottomless pit. Much of this increase came from factors that had been underestimated or ignored. Land acquisition continued to cost far more than expected. Legal battles dragged on for years, adding significant legal expenses. Route changes required new studies, new contracts, and new environmental approvals. Construction material costs also rose sharply over time. Concrete, steel, and skilled labor all became more expensive. In projects of this scale, small cost increases per kilometer quickly translate into billions of additional dollars in the final budget. Another critical issue was management fragmentation. Multiple contractors, separate contracts, and frequent leadership changes created an environment with little continuity and low efficiency. Each new administrator introduced revisions and priority shifts, often undoing previous decisions and causing costly rework. Meanwhile, federal funding, essential to keeping the project alive, became increasingly uncertain. Political changes in Washington affected the flow of money. Administrations supportive of the project were replaced by critics who questioned its viability and threatened to cut funding. The result was a dangerous cycle. Delays caused cost increases, which in turn caused further delays, a domino effect that was difficult to stop. Each year, more money was spent simply to keep the project alive, not to finish it. For many critics, this was the moment when the California high-speed rail stopped being merely a troubled project and became one of the biggest financial disasters in U.S. infrastructure history. And the haunting question remained, just how high could the cost still go? As costs for the California high-speed rail spiraled out of control and deadlines drifted further into the future, the project ceased to be merely a technical or financial challenge and became a political battleground. What was once promoted as a symbol of progress began deeply dividing public opinion, lawmakers, and even infrastructure experts. Politicians who initially supported the project started distancing themselves. Some, fearing electoral backlash, openly questioned its viability. Others called for budget cuts, drastic restructuring, or complete cancellation. The high-speed rail became campaign ammunition, frequently cited as an example of public money waste and government mismanagement. The media played a central role in this shift. Coverage increasingly focused not on promises, but on delays, inflated costs, and unfinished segments that seemed to lead nowhere. Images of isolated viaducts standing in agricultural fields became powerful symbols of failure. For the average citizen, the question was unavoidable. Why are we paying for this? Public support, which had been crucial in approving the initial funding in 2008, began to erode. Polls showed growing skepticism among Californians. Many came to believe the money would be better spent on highways, urban transit systems, or improving existing infrastructure. Internally, the project also suffered from instability. Frequent leadership changes within the authority overseeing the rail system created uncertainty. Each new administration brought a different vision, shifted priorities, and revised goals. This lack of continuity made consistent progress nearly impossible. At the same time, less supportive federal administrations threatened to withdraw previously committed funds. Legal disputes between the state of California and the federal government further increased financial uncertainty. Without stable funding guarantees, private investors backed away, viewing the project as too risky. The result was a politically isolated project. No consensus, no solid backing, and no convincing narrative to justify continued investment. The California high-speed rail survived year after year, not because of enthusiasm, but because too much money had already been spent to simply walk away. In practice, the high-speed rail became a symbol far greater than its original purpose. An example of how major infrastructure projects can fail when politics overtakes technical planning and fiscal responsibility. Facing mounting public, political, and financial pressure, those responsible for the California high-speed rail adopted a new strategy, shrinking the project's scope in an attempt to save it. The goal was no longer to complete the full San Francisco-Los Angeles line in the short or medium term, but to deliver something functional that could justify the billions already spent. This was when proposals emerged to shorten the route. Segments originally intended to connect major urban centers were postponed indefinitely. Instead, the focus shifted to completing a limited stretch within the Central Valley, marketed as an initial operational phase. In practice, it meant a high-speed rail system without true high speed and without connections to the major destinations originally promised. This shift in narrative was met with skepticism. Critics argued that an isolated system far from major cities would see low ridership and minimal practical value. A high-speed train only makes sense when it connects major economic hubs. Without that, the project lost its original purpose. Internally, these revisions added even more complexity. Contracts had to be renegotiated, studies redone, and timelines reset. Each adjustment, though presented as a solution, generated additional costs and delays. The attempt to save the project began to look more like patchwork than a real strategy. At the same time, funding cuts became unavoidable. Federal contributions were reduced or eliminated. The state of California had to redirect funds from other areas just to keep the project alive. This reallocation sparked further criticism, especially as essential public services faced budget constraints. Another critical blow was the definitive loss of private sector interest. Investors, once seen as key partners for the project's final phase, distanced themselves entirely. The risks were too high and the returns too uncertain. As a result, the California high-speed rail entered a state of limbo. It was not officially cancelled, but it also failed to make meaningful progress. The project continued consuming billions without offering a clear vision of when or if it would ever fulfill its original promises. This phase left a clear lesson. When a mega project must be drastically reduced just to survive, the problem is no longer merely financial, it is structural. As the California high-speed rail accumulated delays, budget cuts, and uncertainty, one comparison became unavoidable. Why were other countries able to build successful high-speed rail systems while California failed? This question began dominating technical analyses, international media coverage, and academic debates. In Europe, high-speed systems such as France's TGV, Spain's AVE, and Germany's ICE had been operating for decades, connecting major cities with efficiency, reliability, and relatively controlled costs. In Asia, the contrast was even sharper. Japan's Shinkansen had maintained near-perfect punctuality since the 1960s. China, meanwhile, built the world's largest high-speed rail network in just over a decade. These projects were not simple. They faced technical, environmental, and political challenges similar, and in some cases even greater, than those in California. Yet they succeeded thanks to centralized planning, consistent technical decisions, and stable long-term funding. In the United States, the California case began to be cited as an example of what not to do. International experts highlighted institutional fragmentation, excessive reliance on electoral cycles, and constant legal challenges as factors that made completing megaprojects extremely difficult in the country. The comparison was not only technical, but symbolic. California, considered one of the world's wealthiest economies, was unable to deliver a project that countries with fewer resources had successfully completed. This perception caused international embarrassment and raised doubts about America's ability to execute modern infrastructure projects. Global reports increasingly reference the California high-speed rail as a cautionary tale about over-politicizing engineering projects. The absence of a strong central authority capable of making tough decisions and maintaining direction over decades was cited as a key reason for failure. Domestically, these comparisons further damaged the project's credibility. If other nations could build faster, cheaper, and better, why couldn't California? For many, the answer was simple and uncomfortable. The problem wasn't technology, it was management. The California high-speed rail ceased to be seen as a symbol of innovation and instead came to represent the difficulty the United States faces in adapting its political and administrative structures to the demands of long-term projects. With limited construction progress and continuously escalating costs, independent audits and official investigations into the California high-speed rail became unavoidable. Oversight bodies, audit offices, and legislative committees began scrutinizing every stage of the project, seeking to understand how such an ambitious plan had reached such a critical state. The reports released were devastating. Auditors identified serious governance failures, poor planning, and a lack of transparency in decision-making. One of the most critical issues was the absence of reliable schedules. Deadlines were announced without solid technical foundations, only to be repeatedly revised months later. Another recurring issue highlighted was the systematic underestimation of costs. The reports showed that initial estimates ignored known risks, creating a false sense of feasibility. When those risks materialized, such as legal disputes, environmental delays, and technical challenges, the financial impact was immediate and severe. The audits also emphasized administrative fragmentation as a major obstacle. Multiple agencies, disconnected contracts, and poorly defined responsibilities created an environment in which no single entity appeared to have full control. This lack of clear leadership made swift and effective corrections extremely difficult. Independent reports further criticized communication with the public. Incomplete or overly optimistic information was frequently released, undermining public trust. For many citizens, it became clear that the project had been politically sold in a manner that did not reflect the reality on construction sites. Perhaps the most alarming conclusion from the investigations was the realization that there was no realistic plan to complete the full system. Even with billions more in funding, there were no guarantees that the San Francisco-Los Angeles connection would ever be finished within an acceptable time frame, or finished at all. These reports not only confirmed critics' concerns, but also shifted the tone of the debate. The question was no longer whether the project faced difficulties, but whether it made sense to continue investing in something that appeared structurally unviable. The California high-speed rail was officially recognized as an example of systemic failure, not due to technological limitations, but because of years of accumulated human errors. While political debates, audits, and billion-dollar figures dominated headlines, one aspect of the California high-speed rail often remained overlooked: its direct impact on real people, local communities, and California's economy. The project's failure was not merely institutional; it had tangible consequences. In the Central Valley, farmers and small landowners were among the most affected. Many saw their properties split by unfinished viaducts and rail lines. Others lost productive land after lengthy expropriation processes. In many cases, compensation failed to cover long-term economic losses, fostering resentment and financial insecurity. Small towns that were initially promised economic growth, jobs, and development found themselves trapped in a different reality. Construction began but never finished. Incomplete structures became part of the urban landscape, delivering none of the promised benefits. For many residents, the project brought disruption rather than opportunity. From a financial perspective, California taxpayers ultimately paid the price. Billions of dollars in public funds were allocated to a system that failed to deliver proportional returns. Resources that could have gone towards schools, healthcare, housing, or urban transit were absorbed by a project with no clear completion timeline. The damage also extended to institutional credibility. Public trust in large government-led infrastructure projects was deeply shaken. Every new infrastructure announcement began to face skepticism, criticism, and doubt from the outset. The California high-speed rail became the go-to example whenever ambitious public projects were proposed. Economically, the project created distortions as well. Contractors benefited from change orders and delays, while the risks remained public. This dynamic reinforced criticism about privatized profits and socialized losses, a recurring pattern in failed megaprojects worldwide. Perhaps the most profound damage, however, was symbolic. The high-speed rail was meant to represent the future of mobility in the United States. Instead, it came to symbolize frustration, waste, and lost opportunities. A project designed to unite regions ended up widening the gap between government and society. In practical terms, the California high-speed rail demonstrated that when major projects fail, the cost is not only financial, it is social, political, and psychological. The California high-speed rail did not go down in history merely as a delayed or overpriced project. It became a global case study on how major infrastructure projects can fail when ambition, politics, and engineering are misaligned. Its legacy goes far beyond unfinished tracks and billions spent. It leaves behind hard but essential lessons. The first lesson is clear. Mega projects cannot survive unrealistic promises. From the very beginning, California's bullet train was sold to the public with underestimated costs, overly optimistic timelines, and exaggerated benefits. When reality caught up, public trust was already broken. Engineering demands accuracy, not political marketing. The second lesson concerns governance. Projects of this scale require strong technical leadership, administrative stability, and insulation from electoral cycles. In California's case, constant leadership changes, political disputes, and fragmented decision-making created an environment where no one had full control, and without control, progress is impossible. Another fundamental issue is funding. Major infrastructure projects need stable and predictable financial support. The California high-speed rail never had that certainty. Every political shift put the project at risk, driving away investors and driving costs higher. A project without stable funding is a project destined for instability. There is also a social lesson. When governments fail to deliver on their promises, the damage extends beyond budgets. It erodes public trust, harms local communities, and creates resistance to future infrastructure investments, even when those investments are necessary. Finally, the project raises an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. Are the United States prepared to execute long-term projects in the 21st century? The failure of the California high-speed rail suggests that technology is not the main barrier. The real challenge lies in political, legal, and administrative structures. California's high-speed rail began as a symbol of the future. Today, it stands as a warning, a reminder that big ideas require more than good intentions. They require rigorous planning, difficult decisions, and accountability for public money. On Wrong Project, this story isn't told to mock engineering, but to understand its limits, because learning from past mistakes is the only way to avoid repeating the same failures in the future. And thus ends the story of one of the greatest failures in modern engineering.